Hi, Commander Mark Danielson, retired out of Naval Air Station Fort Worth here, and used to be Carswell Air Force Base, and it's still Carswell Field as far as the airfield goes. I was the project officer back in 1993 and 94 to reopen this base as a joint reserve base. We closed several bases in order to make this one work and try and reduce all of the duplication of effort that we found at other bases. What you hear in the background right now are some of the Air Force Reserve 301st F-16s flying around, and we've also seen some F-35s earlier today. So this particular park is just right outside the base, and this is one of the C9s that used to be flying out here with VR-59. It's actually not VR-59 markings, but that's irrelevant. They made an interesting sculpture out of what was a DC-9 or C-9B, and they talked about making it a weather vane at one point, but I think that idea passed by the wayside. The park itself is available to anybody walking or driving around the base because it's outside the gates, and there's a nice parkway, and it talks about the history of the base and Carswell himself. One of the things that's interesting about the DC-9 was it was cable driven and not hydraulically as opposed to most aircraft, and that moved the trim tabs, which moved the flight controls, and it was a real simple airplane to fly. Just a lot of fun. I flew it for a couple of years while I was on the wing staff out here. So anyway, we'll take you on a base tour and show you some of the aircraft that are on the base trying to preserve the history. All right, so here we are in front of headquarters with the A4 Mighty Mike, and this was one of 4 A4 Mikes that was stationed at NAS Dallas as an adversary aircraft. And Dallas was unique in that we had an operational maintenance division that had 4 aircraft actually assigned to the station and not part of a squadron. The Mike is pretty interesting because it has a big bubble canopy on here. It had a self-starting unit. It had an F4 drag chute, and you could land this thing in 1,500 feet if you used the F4 drag chute, which I did several times for maintenance. And that's pretty much about the same thing you're going to get with a field arrestment. It was stripped down with the hump. Anything we could take off, we took off. It had a HUD in there, which we no longer had any use for. And we got it down to 10,500 pounds on the empty weight with a P408 engine on it that had 11,200 pounds of thrust on there. That made it pretty good. So back in the day when you were fighting the F4 or the A4, the F-14s, they could go vertical, and that worked pretty well until you got the big engines, and then you could just shoot them at the top of a loop. So that energy disadvantage for the A4 went away. The A4 was designed as a nuclear bomber, so that's why it sits so high off the ground. It had a big nuke that was underneath, and it's been a host of an enormous amount of missions besides the Blue Angels and the training command using that, and a bomber and adversary airplane, what we used it for. We also had other target towing missions that we would use. There were missiles that we would launch off of here for targets. There was Sea-Whiz, which is your 20 millimeters on board the ships with automatic radar tracking. I would tow a target with them occasionally that went out 5 miles behind you. You actually had 30,000 feet of cable in. That was with a big target that carried its own transponder, so they didn't lock onto the wrong target. But this airplane was never replaced with anything that could do as many rolls as it did. The slats were aerodynamic. They're bolted up right now for display, but they would drop down, they'd go up whenever they needed to. And when you're in a fight, when you actually go to a turn and you start getting a little bit slow, then the slats are going to come out. That's the normal thing. But there was a problem with one slat coming out versus the other. Asymmetrical slat condition could cause all kinds of issues. And normally what it would do, and I had this happen several times, one would come out, boom, the airplane would rack into the other direction, and you put in bottom rudder and you just use it to your advantage, because now you can make a really tight turn and bottom, and then go up in the vertical and actually bunt the aircraft a little bit and pull it to get both your slats out. And now he's lost sight, you're way on top, and it's over in a matter of seconds from that point. So it wasn't a planned maneuver, but it worked out. He also had unplanned situations with an asymmetrical slat. I had that happen flying 250 knots just in a circle. One slat came out, the airplane went out of control, went into a spin inside the weather, canopy completely iced over, and did the normal spin recovery and popped out of the weather, and the ice sheeted off. It wasn't a big deal, and I figured it was probably time to go home at that point. So things happen with asymmetrical slats that you don't necessarily want. The stab on the back end here is in a position that we would actually fly it. Now when I say in a position, we didn't fly it with the stick moving the elevator. We flew it so that you would minimize the induced drag, and that meant using the trim. And if you use the trim, then the entire stab is moving like it would be on an F-14. And that worked out quite well. If you had the stab stuck all the way nose up, it wasn't a big deal. You could just land the airplane with full flaps. It was pretty much in that position anyway. But if you got to the point where you had the stab all the way up and you're using an elevator, now you have an awful lot of induced drag, and you're working in an area that you don't want to work in. You want to keep the energy up. This back here, that was your drag chute that came out, of course the tail hook, and those are always functional on all of our airplanes so that if we needed them we could use them. But only the Mike had this, and got to remember that the Marines used this airplane as a forward deploying aircraft, and therefore you had a short field arrestment, and you had a good power for takeoff. They could put JATO bottles right here and give it a short field takeoff performance, and the self-starting unit, so it actually could take off on the metal track runways if they needed to. That's about all there is on this one. These are your speed brakes here.
Do you have any fun or interesting stories about flying the A4?
Oh gosh. You know, when you're in the adversary business, the horizon doesn't matter. It's all relative to the other aircraft that you're fighting, and particularly in the lower performance models, the E model, the TA4J, you're always running out of energy, and so you would, if you had gas, you'd always fight. So the fuel gauge wasn't that big of a deal. But if you're out of energy, then you just say, I'm ballistic, and you just have to wait until the airplane figures out what it wants to do. You may be a tail slide, or you may be doing a flop of some kind going forward, or a tumble, or whatever. You just waited it out until you got airspeed. You went through normal procedures. You'd run the trim down to 0 to 4 degrees so that you could get the flying airspeed back, and then you fought again. And then sometimes, at the end of a fight, the F-14s always ran out of gas first. We would go with a 1V1V1 or 1V many or whatever, with whatever airplanes are still out there with gas. You're up in the vertical, you're out of knots, the airplane's just ballistic, you've called it. But if there's an airplane on top of you that's also ballistic, now you don't know where anybody's going to go and nobody's in control. And so you're just kind of counting to 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, and if you are still alive, then you did good, and you go back and get your energy up and fight again. You know, whatever happens, happens, and you move on. You never think about the near hits that you had or whatever. You know, it's a moment in time that's gone.
Talk about the roll rate on the A4. That's always a big thing to talk about.
Well, the roll rate at normal performance was 720 degrees per second. And of course that, as you get slower, is going to decrease. But at the slow speed range, you're really using the rudder. You're not using any ailerons. Ailerons can put you out of control. But you can rudder the airplane around very easily. So if you're on top of a target, which is what you wanted to be, hopefully with the sun behind you, then you can just maneuver into a position, and nose position is everything in a fight. That's all that matters is nose position. So if you can get that nose pointing at somebody, you can put some kind of a weapon system on them. Probably the best fight that I ever had was myself versus a friend in F-18. I was flying, could have been this very airplane, and we went out. It was strictly a knife fight, where we're just visual guns only, basically, and neither of us could get a shot. It was that close. You know, you're just pretty much canopy turning, trying to get slow, forcing somebody out in front, but both of us were experienced enough where we didn't let that happen. And that's probably the biggest thing that we were trying to teach, was keep your energy up and avoid that kind of a situation, because you're probably going to lose. And in most cases, if you saw a big bat turn, whether it was on an F-18 or on an F-16, and all the vapors coming off the wings, then you know it's going to be a short fight, because usually they're out of energy. They can't turn the same way that the A4 can. We could do a loop at 200 knots if you really worked at it. So 250 knots was a better speed for doing a loop, but you could go over the top at 200 knots. That works out pretty well. I think probably one of the more amusing stories was when we were taking these airplanes out to the boneyard, and I was flying the lead, and my wingman had one of the old cameras. This is back in 1994, before the video cameras came out on your phones. And he almost hit me a couple of times, because looking through the little lens finders, you know, everything looks a little different in size. And we landed at Tucson after we took the airplanes through the gate for the final time, and we go into base operations, and he goes, "Oh, forgot to load the camera." So we went through all of that with 2 near hits for nothing. So that was pretty funny.
Now, is this the A4 that you were the last one to fly it, or is that another one?
This particular airplane was the last one that I flew, and it was because we broke one of the aileron attach fittings. Well, we didn't, I did. It broke. And when that happened, the airplane was no longer flyable. We needed to either fix it and take it out to the boneyard, or we had to figure something else out. And I wanted to keep it as a museum airplane, and we were able to do that. It was in better shape then. I see we've had some damage, but that happens when you move airplanes around. And this was also the first airplane that we flew over from NAS Dallas to Fort Worth here, courtesy of the Chinooks with the Army Guard. Yeah, we delivered this airplane with no problems, and that was the test airplane. I knew that I could get another A4 if something went seriously wrong, but it just came in and it flew very nicely. And we actually had a TA4 that we had problems with in Miramar. The pilot actually had a fire and dead sticked it into Tucson, or excuse me, Davis. That was Yuma. Sorry, Yuma. And the tail section that was burned up went in one direction, and the engine went in another direction. And now I was stuck with this forward because the tail section was gone, and I had to figure out a way to get it back to Miramar in San Diego. The TA4 fuselage and wings were stuck in Yuma, and they brought a sky crane down from Reno, and I was out at Miramar waiting. I was the maintenance officer at the time, waiting for the airplane to get there. And the good news was it made it, but when it went into a hover, because there was no weight and no tail section, the airplane just spun. It just spun. And there was this standoff going on, how we were going to get this aircraft on the ground. Now, fortunately, the nose wheel is a free castering nose wheel, and there was a slight tip to that, and they couldn't hover forever, obviously, so they got to a point where they just lowered it where it was just inches off the ground, then they dropped it, and it spun around and then stopped. And I still have my job after that, so it worked out pretty well. Well, there's just all kinds of things that you could talk about with this airplane, but they're all good. I do know 3 people that have jumped out of 2 of them each. I came close a couple of times, but I didn't ever have to. All right, we're here at the Carswell Memorial, and this was very important to me. We had this created to make sure that we didn't lose the history of the base. Right here we talk about Carswell Field. And it's kind of interesting because it was a aerodrome for the Army first, and then it became an Air Force base, and now it's a Joint Reserve Base, and all that history is depicted right here. They also filmed the Strategic Air Command movie with Jimmy Stewart right here, and that was pretty cool too. But this is a B-24 prop, and Horace Carswell was a Medal of Honor winner who was awarded that posthumously after his B-24 crashed. He'd ordered his crew to bail out in order to try and save them, and he didn't make it. So we've selected the B-24 prop, and this eagle that was beautifully made by Darren Wright, a local sculptor here in Fort Worth. And it just represents the freedom that we have in this country thanks to all those that have served. We've actually been able to keep Carswell Field in the name of the runway itself, and as far as I know, that will always be that way. There's no need to change that. Horace used to be buried here on the base, and that was moved when they were closing the base in 1992, and he's buried in Fort Worth somewhere. But his memory is still here and always will be at the base itself. We'll get this thing polished up, and we're going to be moving it out to the Park Avenue, the Military Parkway, shortly, where it will join some other monuments that are out there. Everybody will be able to see it. Right now it's in front of base operations, and most people don't get a chance to see it or even know about it. So that's about all there is on that. I'm real proud of it anyway. I'm standing in front of the F-16N for Navy, and this is kind of an interesting airplane. I've been working on getting a lot of aircraft out here for display, and the Navy called me up and asked me if I wanted an F-16, and I said absolutely, because the Air Force couldn't give them one. And it's painted in 457th colors because the 457th, part of the 301st Air Wing, is flying the F-16s, soon to be going to the F-35s. So we got this airplane over here from VF-45 down in Key West, and pulled the engine out of it, and 301st gave it to Lockheed, and Lockheed painted it up in the 457th colors. They put some dummy ordnance on it, which isn't on it anymore. And about 2 months later, I got a call up from the colonel in the Pentagon, and he says, "Have you got an F-16 on a stick out there?" And I said, "Yes, we do." And he says, "Well, we don't like that." And I said, "So?" And then he went on and he said, "Well, how's it painted?" And I said, "It's in 457 colors." He says, "Well, we don't like that." I said, "It's my Admiral's airplane. He likes it. You got a problem, call him." And I hung up. And the airplane's still here. And it's important to have all of the airplanes that have been flying out of Carswell to be represented. So behind us, we have an F-105 and an F-4 that were flown by the Air Force Reserve 457th before they went to the F-16s. And we can talk a little bit more about those as we take a look at those airplanes. The adversary airplane, though, this F-16N, the problem with it was used up in a matter of a few years. They'd exceeded the service life on it. The A-4 had been around forever, and it was a metal airplane, and it kept flying and still would if we still had them. But they deemed it outdated. Let's move on to the F-4. These actually moved in order to direct the airflow so that at a supersonic speed, the engine wouldn't flame out. Supersonic versus subsonic flight really is insignificant because of the way that these airplanes are made. And one of the things that you see on the fuselage on this F4 is it's got that Coke bottle shape, and they found that out with the F-106 versus the F-102. That Coke bottle shape allowed it to fly supersonic with a real minimal transition. All that you'd see is your airspeed increase, go to Mach 1 or whatever. It's got the gun on the bottom because they didn't design it with a gun. They figured when they were flying these airplanes around, it was missile time and no one would ever get in close enough to get into a dogfight where you needed the gun. But that proved to be wrong. This gun was also effective for strafing, so it proved to be a very good target killing mechanism. When I was flying the F4s over in Korea, we were flying the D model, and we had the gun on the bottom, and it was always a hot gun, whether we had steel rounds in it or it was loaded with something else. At least we had some kind of ordnance on board, and they were very accurate. They maintained those extremely well. Of course, we have the Sidewinder missiles on here, and those were designed as the air-to-air. They've had a lot of different iterations of that, but it's a very good weapon system. And then they have radar missiles, which were the AIM-7, and that actually goes back to Korean vintage when they were designing the first radar missiles. This airplane had boundary layer control to keep the airplane flying at a slow speed, which allowed you to come aboard a carrier or fly into an airfield with a very stabilized approach. They later went to the E model with the slats as opposed to leading edge flaps, and I personally preferred the hard wing. This is what we call the hard wing with the boundary layer control. The funny thing about airplanes is if you're flying the cockpit, you never care about what size the airplane is. And it wasn't until one day I was standing in the cockpit and I was looking back that I realized it was actually a pretty big airplane, because it never felt big. It flew very well. Down low, it was an extremely stable airplane. And I hate to say this, but when you're young, you tend to fly more aggressively. And my backseater and I always felt like we were going to fly to war. We were going to practice the same way that we would in actual combat. And we were on a mission down in the Philippines for what they call a Cope Thunder exercise. And we were the ground spare for the exercise. So that meant if somebody fell out of the formation because of a maintenance issue, we would have been called up, and we had some 500-pound bombs on board that were inert. And we had a gun and we had drop tanks. We were ready to go. And when it didn't get used, they said, well, you can go fly it. You can fly the same mission solo, which is pretty much a license to kill. So we did. We were flying the low level and the weather was low and it kept getting lower, and we were about 75 feet doing 450 knots, and the ceiling kept getting down and down and down to the point where we were almost IFR at 75 feet. So we pulled up to the safe altitude, flying in the clouds. We're navigating off the INS and made our points, and then we're over the water, and this was Luzon that we have been passing over, and there was a big hole. So down we went, and we're 15 feet off the water, and right in front of us was a little boat, little canoe basically, with a guy standing up in it. And I could have done something different, but I didn't. I mean, it was fate that he happened to be there, and so I looked in the mirrors after we passed overhead. The boat was still there and he wasn't. So I don't know whether I blew him into the water or whether he dove into the water, but he got wet, and I'm sure he was cursing a Yankee dog. But you know, it was a lot of fun, and we continued the mission and rolled in on the target, and it just happened to be one of those great days where the bombs went right through the target. And I went back, and there was a guy who I'd gone through F4 training with, and he was in the sister squadron over there, and I didn't really care much for him, but he happened to be the range officer that day. And he came back and was talking about what a great mission that was and where the bombs went. And I thought, well, that was the icing on the cake for a pretty good story. But the last mission that I had in the F4 was probably the most frustrating, because it was set up basically like this: no drop tanks, it had a gun, it had a couple of missiles on board, and I was free to engage any aircraft out there. It was a single ship, and the only thing flying was a P-3. This is over in Korea. And I said, well, give me a vector. So I found the P-3, and I was up on a perch, and I rolled in on him and promptly pulled the power back to idle, and the speed brakes out, did a big barrel roll around him, still too much closure, big barrel around him, and joined up on his wing at about 240 knots. And they were too busy eating their catering to even notice me. So after flying formation with them for a while, I just gradually rolled over, because at that speed it doesn't want to fly, and left. But that was it. It was so disappointing, because I was hoping for at least a good fight. This 105 over here was another one of the 301st Fighter Wing aircraft. And it was a big performer over in Vietnam. When I say a big performer, I mean in terms of size and missions. Fudd Ridge was probably where they flew most of their missions. It was a ridge that went through Vietnam, where they could kind of hide behind, and on their trip into North Vietnam. And as it turns out, this particular airplane was the last one that a friend of mine, Vic Viscara, flew, and he ended up jumping out of one over there in Vietnam. So it was nice to be able to tie that in. But this nuclear bomber turned into a massive conventional bomber because it was needed. You can't drop nukes in a conventional war, obviously. So the internal bomb bay was kind of closed shut and put on with extra fuel or whatever, and they put on as many bombs as they could hold. And they did get a few air-to-air kills with the gun on this airplane, but it was not a very good air-to-air airplane, so its best mission was to try and use the acceleration and the speed that it had and get away from the fight and live and fight another day. And it was the fastest airplane in the Vietnam War. Everything you need to know.
All the charts and everything?
Yeah, all your paper charts. Approach plates, still use these. Put them on your knee board, or on your knee. Just figure out where you wanted to go and fill out your flight plan and file it. Off you go into the wild blue yonder. It's a lot easier civilian. We're standing in front of the F-80, and this particular aircraft is near and dear to my heart. It belongs to the Texas Air National Guard. It was one of the airplanes that they flew as they progressed up to their current C-130 aircraft. And it sat out in NAS Dallas for as long as I can remember. They maintained it and did a great job. As you can see, they still do. And when we were moving the base over here, we needed to get 4 aircraft over here from NAS Dallas. The first aircraft that I flew over was the A4, as we discussed earlier. I want to make sure everything went fine, and it did. And this aircraft, the Air Guard assured me that everything was all set, and I was here and they were over in the Dallas, so I assumed everything would be fine. But when I was out on the flight line waiting for the aircraft to show up, I was advised there was a problem and it wouldn't be coming. So I later saw the video footage of it, and it was quite interesting. It actually ended up on America's Funniest Videos. May as well if you have something to share like that. But the Air Guard, when they first flew over the aircraft and they're trying to hook up the harness, the right main landing gear took out the canopy and shattered that, so it was gone. And then they got the aircraft harnessed up. Meanwhile, you got to remember the CH-47's hovering overhead the whole time. They lifted it up, and when it got just a few feet off the ground, the bolts that hold the fuselage together, and it's designed so that the back end can slide out to change the engine, sheared, and the tail section was now 90 degrees to the aircraft. And they dropped it, and that's how it ended up, and everything was just fine until they brought the Chinook back to recover their harness. And when they were landing, it blew the tail section all the way across the parking lot, and there it sat. So it was supposed to be on display here for the opening ceremony, which was only a few weeks away. And thankfully, we had a joint effort between the Navy and the Marines, the Air Force, all worked together to get this aircraft back on display. They made a fiberglass canopy for it and put it back together with the correct bolts. Had it fixed with all the damage that was done, which was relatively minor. And we flew it over without a canopy on it this time, and no problems. And when they brought the F-86 over, made sure they took the canopy off first. A little lesson learned, made sure they had the right bolts in and so forth. But anyway, it's on display here on the Military Parkway as one of the two aircraft featured from the Air Guard, and I'm so happy to have it. This is the F-86 that belonged to the Texas Air National Guard. They've done a really nice job of maintaining it overall. And this one was flown over from NAS Dallas. It made it safely because, again, the canopy was taken off beforehand. It's probably one of the best fighters that they had to compete against the early MiGs. And the radar on the nose shows this was a later model of the F-86. Made it a night fighter as well. It had the internal guns, and it had missiles, and with that they achieved a far greater kill ratio than the MiGs were able to handle, even though in many ways the MiG was superior. One of the problems that the MiG had was it couldn't pull out of a high-speed dive very well, so they kind of fixed that problem by putting a longer stick in it, give it more leverage. What we're coming up on is a Strategic Air Command monument, and Bob Adams, pretty much the base historian for Carswell, was responsible for putting this all together. And this particular bomb, as it shows here, it was the heaviest ever, 42,500 pounds, carried on the B-36. And most people don't realize the B-36 was even a weapon. The Cold War, though, the B-36 was airborne 24 hours a day and was able to respond anywhere. It was the largest bomber built for many, many, many years. It had props and it had jet engines. And the inside of it, if you looked at the cockpit, it was kind of like the Starship Enterprise. And you walk through a large tube and you go into the back, and the crew quarters had full-size bunk beds and stove. Not exactly what you're used to seeing in that technology of aircraft. But he's documented the history of Strategic Air Command very well with all of the plaques on the back. And we moved this monument for the B-50 round the world flight out here because this was the most appropriate place. It shows that it was the first non-stop flight around the world in any aircraft, and it took off from Fort Worth and ended here back in 1949. It's appropriately suited among the rest of the Strategic Air Command monuments to keep the base alive, the memory of what this base used to be when it was an active Air Force base. I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that bomb. All right, we're standing in front of the F-14 that, of course, Tom Cruise made famous in Top Gun. And it was a very good airplane in many respects. It served the Navy well as a defense mechanism. It could shoot missiles at long distance if the rules of engagement allowed you to do so. But what we did in the adversary community was try and teach these guys not to get into that close-in environment. And in most cases, it was a good lesson. One of the problems that the F-14 had was flat spins. And the way that the engines are situated, there's a significant difference between the two of them. If you had a side slip angle, you could tend to block out the airflow on one of the engines and flame it out. And that was kind of highlighted in the movie Top Gun, although it went straight down at 20,000 feet per minute. You couldn't go out to sea with it. While I was the safety officer at Dallas, we lost an F-14, and it was trying to maneuver against a A4 that was on its tail in gun range, and he kicked in the rudder and again flamed out the engine. The airplane ended up in a flat spin. And I was on the base. The wing commander happened to be there visiting. The squadron commander, when I walked in and told him they just lost an airplane, I didn't have many details on it at that point, but I saw it on the news and I knew I was going to get hit with having to be the chief investigator on that. The wings were completely spread, 64 feet, and it was perfectly flat. So before I even went out to the site, I knew it was a flat spin. And when we got out there, the aircraft had rotated about 10 or 15 degrees and stopped. So that confirmed what we already knew. So one of the unfortunate things about that particular accident was the backseater couldn't get out. And there's nothing worse than arriving on site while they're extracting the body of somebody you were talking to a day earlier. The problem was that the front seater did get out. The problem on that accident investigation was kind of twofold. It was, why did the airplane crash? Well, that was fairly simple, but why did we lose the back seater? And as it turned out, the rotation of the aircraft was such that in a freak accident, the canopy clipped the ejection seat for the rear ejection and bent the firing pin. So everything worked perfectly fine up until that point, and then the seat wasn't firing, and it's like being on the inside of a toilet bowl. There was no way for him to physically climb out, but he was screaming all the way down on the intercom, the radio, and it was pretty sad to listen to. But what was interesting about that, and I'm not trying to paint a bad picture of the F-14, it was a great airplane, but in the time that we were investigating that crash, the Navy lost 4 more F-14s due to flat spin accidents. This is the UH-34 that used to belong to the Carswell Museum, and we inherited that when we established the base. It was in pretty bad shape. Marines have done a really good job. Volunteer groups really have done a great job of bringing it back to life. This was a big heavy lift helicopter in the Vietnam War before the Chinooks came along. And we're proud to have it on display because it still shows the history of the base. Back in 1994, the Marines were the only ones that were transitioning to the F-18. They had F-4s at the time. This particular aircraft is a Marine aircraft that was flown for a short period of time at NAS Dallas before it became static display. And we needed to fly that particular aircraft over because the Marines wanted to strip it in NAS Dallas. And that posed a little bit more of a challenge than the other aircraft because of its sheer size. The Marines had assured everybody that the aircraft was stripped at its minimum weight, and that proved not to be the case. When the CH-47 was hovering over it, after connecting the harness, it wouldn't budge. So they hovered over it for a little bit longer in order to try and burn out some gas, and they gave it the 1-2 again, and nothing happened. But the Guard was really good about not giving up. They'd already flown 3 aircraft over successfully. So they actually dragged the Hornet over to the runway at NAS Dallas and did a rolling takeoff with it so that the Hornet created its own lift, and they managed to get it off the ground safely, and they flew it over to the base in Fort Worth. They did a really good job of delivering the aircraft safe, and it's still on display after all these years. And we salute all the people that have made the base out at Fort Worth Carswell operational, and all veterans who have contributed to their service. So thanks for watching.